Hey guys, this is Brother Ray Jones with the First Church of God in Princeton, West Virginia. I want to welcome you to our midweek Bible study. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be a part of this time of online learning and growing together. I'm very grateful that I get to be a part of your spiritual development. I'm thankful that you're being a part of mine as well. Tonight, we're going to look together in 2 Samuel chapters 1 through 5. Now, don't get alarmed, we won't be reading all of those chapters, but I would encourage you to take some time to read through those at your leisure. Tonight, we are going to talk about the time when King David actually assumes the throne. That's going to be a very exciting time in David's life, and we're looking forward to getting into that tonight. So go ahead and be looking in 2 Samuel, beginning at chapter 1. And while you're turning there, let me remind you that we would love it if you would participate. Let us know you're here and watching. Feel free to use one of those emoji buttons, and if you hear something that you like. And as always, if there is something in this that blesses you and you believe it would bless others, we would be thrilled if you would pass this on to them. So let's think for a moment tonight about a phrase that we're all familiar with. It says, patience is a virtue. I believe that is true, but I've also got to confess tonight, if patience is a virtue, there are many days that I wake up not feeling very virtuous. Maybe you can identify with that. Well, the truth is, patience is more than just a virtue. It is one of the fruit of the Spirit. It's one of the 9 characteristics that God says in His Word is going to be a mark of those who choose to follow Him. It's not optional, it's required. Now, God made some promises about patience. As hard as it is to be patient, one of the great things about it is it does really indeed pay off. God made this promise in Isaiah, the 40th chapter, beginning at verse 28. Have you not known, have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, neither faints nor is weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the weak, and to those who have no might he increases strength. Even the youths shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall. But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. God assures us that when we wait on Him, when we wait on His timing, it's going to be worthwhile. That is noteworthy, my friends, and it is something that gives us hope while we're waiting on God to move and work, okay? Now, I get it. Even though we have this promise, it can still be difficult to flesh this out, so to speak. But David is a good example of putting patience into practice and seeing good come to fruition. He was God's chosen man to be the king, but he had to wait for some time in order to take the throne. His patience did eventually pay off, and we're going to look at that tonight and see what we can learn from this part of David's life, all right? Now, if you went back into 1 Samuel, the 31st chapter, you would read the story of how King Saul had his life ended. Now, basically what happened is Saul's army, the Israelites, were fighting against the Philistines, and the Philistines were winning. And it happened that an archer drew his bow, and he struck King Saul. And Saul wanted out of the battle, and he told his armor bearer to basically kill him, to end his life, because he wasn't going to get any better, and he didn't want the Philistines to capture him alive and torture him. Well, his armor bearer would not do that, so Saul ended up falling on his own sword. Now, his son Jonathan and others also died in that battle, and Saul's life came to a tragic end. Now, at this point, David is going to assume the throne, but it's not going to happen in quite the way that he would have hoped. So Saul is dead, and David knew he was going to be the king long before he actually got the position. But he was around 17 when Jesse called him in from the field, and Samuel anointed him as king. You remember that story as we've studied David's life. David was out keeping the sheep, and Samuel was told of the Lord to go to Jesse's house and that he would show him who was going to be the next king. And all of David's sons, minus David, or all of Jesse's sons, rather, minus David, were called in, and they started from the oldest to the next to youngest in this case. And when Samuel saw Eliab, the oldest, he was tall and handsome, and he thought, surely this is the Lord's anointed. And God said to him, hey, don't look on the outside like man does, but you need to understand you need to look like I do on the heart. So they go one by one from the oldest to the next to youngest, and none of them are approved as king. And Samuel just looks at Jesse and says, hey, do you not have any more kids? And he says, well, we got little David out there, but he's just young and inexperienced, and he's busy taking care of the sheep, and surely he couldn't be the one you're looking for. Samuel said, we're not going to proceed any further until you bring him here. Well, when David showed up, God said, that's my boy. That's the one who's going to be the king. And Samuel anointed him as king that day. Now understand, David was around 17 years old when all of this went down. And in 2 Samuel, the 5th chapter, verses 4 and 5, we read these words. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. Think about that for a moment. David was around 17 years of age when Samuel poured that oil over his head and said, you're anointed as the next king. It was 13 years later before he actually began leading as king. 13 years. 13 years is 156 months. It is 4,745 days. In some respects, that's a short time. But when you're waiting to assume a position that God's told you that you're going to have and you're going to get to be the leader, boy, that's a long time to wait. What have you learned to wait for in your life? I've often said to people, you spend some of the best years of your life waiting around. And my friends, somebody's done the math and figured out that's actually true. I would always say it just kind of as a joke. But somebody's done the math and figured out that over a lifetime, we're going to spend approximately 6 months at stoplights. Boy, I know that's true. There's one over in Bluefield, Virginia, coming out of Sam's Club. I felt like I spent about a day and a half just sitting at that one not too long ago. 6 months total at stoplights. We're going to spend 8 months opening junk mail. Wow, think about that. That's a lot of junk mail to go through if 8 months of our life are going to be invested in going through junk mail. I'm going to kind of shorten that in my lifetime if I can. Identify it quickly and put it in file 13. Well, we spend 6 months at stoplights, 8 months at opening junk mail. We spend 18 months looking for lost stuff. Imagine that. I'm guilty, okay? I put stuff away so well just where I can find it. I hide it so well, I can't even find it for myself. I forget where I put it. I'll spend 18 months of my life, cumulatively speaking, looking for lost things. Then, if that doesn't top it all off, we're going to spend 5 years waiting in various lines. Think about that. All those trips to Disney or to some of these other amusement parks, or just being at Kroger or Walmart or some other store, and we're complaining about those self-checkouts, right? Well, maybe that'll shorten some of that time that we get to wait in line. The post office, oh yeah, let's not forget about that one. That can be a big one where we get to wait in line, right? You add all that up together, and we're spending 5 years rather of our lives waiting in line. That's interesting. Well, David waited 13 years to become king. That's a long time to wait. And while he waited, he had to go through some suffering. You remember as we've studied his life that he had to, while he was serving under King Saul, he had to run for his life because King Saul was so insanely jealous of him. And he went from staying in the castle and having very nice accommodations and being there with his wife and all that kind of thing, to having to be out in the field and to be camping and sleeping in caves and under the night sky and just in any place that he possibly could. He went from leading Saul's army to leading a group of 400 to 600 thugs, basically, people who were in trouble. They were mercenaries. Now, they knew how to fight, but they needed leadership. And David spent that time, those 13 years, organizing them and helping them be better men. But through all of this, David had a lot of suffering going on. Now, the truth of the matter is, we can learn more a lot of times through difficult times than we can through easy times. Someone has summed this up in a little poem called Pleasure and Sorrow. It goes like this: I walked a mile with pleasure, she chattered all the way, but left me none the wiser for all she had to say. I walked a mile with sorrow, and ne'er a word said she, but oh, the things I learned from her when sorrow walked with me. Think about that for a moment. There's a whole lot of truth in that little poem. When things are going well, we enjoy it, and a lot of times we let our guard down, and a lot of times we take things for granted. But when things are going bad, we listen closer to God. We cry out to Him more. And a lot of times it's in our pain that we learn more. Well, what are you trying to say, Brother Ray? Is it better to have bad times than good times? No, that's not what I'm saying at all. I want you to have good times. I want to have good times myself. But the reality is there are going to be times of suffering that come into this world. Now, I don't want you to have one bit more of that than is absolutely necessary. But when those difficult times come, I want you to remember there are things that can be learned in those times that we might not learn in other ways or at other times. So when those times come, and while we are waiting, in those times of suffering, let's be careful to draw closer to God. David had to wait, and while he was waiting, he went through quite a bit of suffering. And remember this, while he waited, he maintained his integrity. David had the opportunity on 2 distinct occasions to end Saul's life and to expedite his time of going to the throne. But David refused to do that because the word of God at that time was very clear. You don't put your hand against the Lord's anointed. And Saul was, although he wasn't acting like it, he was the Lord's anointed. And David refused to kill him or to let his men kill him 2 distinct times. Well, David showed himself to be a man of integrity while he was waiting. And when you and I have to wait on things for whatever reason, we would do well to maintain our integrity through that time. David teaches us that. Well, another thing that we find out as King Saul passes away and David assumes the throne, when David became king, he did not get the entire kingdom all at once. If you read in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 11, we find these words. And the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. When David first becomes king, he's not accepted by all the tribes. Judah accepts him to begin with. 2 Samuel, the 5th chapter, verses 4 and 5 highlights this. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem, he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. At the beginning of all of this, after King Saul dies, it's only Judah who's ready for David to be king. So he steps on up and he leads that number of people. It's not until 7.5 years later that he gets to rule over all of Israel. So David's waiting could have left him very tempted to say, when he does get the throne, he wants the full deal. But that's not what was happening. That was not his reality. So what did David do? He accepted what the Lord had for him at that moment. That was better than nothing at all. And he waited still, and he was faithful in that time for 7.5 years, leading just one of the tribes of Israel. 7.5 years later, all the others followed suit. Sometimes when we're waiting, God gives us a stepping stone along the way to get there. And when that happens, my friends, we need to be willing to simply accept that and to be faithful with what the Lord's entrusted to our care. Jesus in the New Testament tells us a parable about these guys who had different talents. And one had 5, one had 3, and one had 5, one had 2, and one had just 1. And the one who had been given 5 and the one who had been given 2 doubled their talents, but the one who'd been given 1 buried his in the dirt and didn't do anything with it. He didn't lose anything, but he didn't gain anything. Well, to the ones who had gained more, Jesus made this comment in the parable. You've been faithful over a few things, I will give you greater. When we take what the Lord's given us and we steward that well, we're preparing ourselves to be a recipient of something greater later on. God sees that and he will not overlook that. So whatever you've been waiting on, continue to wait patiently. And when God gives the answer, if it's only a little bit right now, receive that and let the Lord help you steward that in the best possible way. And trust God to give you the rest in his own way and in his own time. David didn't get the whole kingdom to begin with. The last thing that we want to see tonight is something that we can never overstate. It is simply this: God was with David. 2 Samuel, the 5th chapter, the 10th verse, we read these words. So David went on and became great, and the Lord of hosts was with him. God was with David. My friends, when God's with you, when you're on God's side, you really can't fail. The Lord was with David. The Lord was with David the day he got anointed to be king. The Lord was with David when he stood before the giant Goliath. The Lord was with David when Saul was throwing spears at him and trying to take his life. The Lord was with David when he had to flee and hide. The Lord was with David and his men when Saul was about to catch them and they were hiding in that cave. And the Lord was with David when David spared Saul's life 2 different times. The Lord was with David when he had served his men. He and his men had served as protection over Nabal's shepherds, and Nabal didn't want to pay up, and David got angry and wanted to take his life. The Lord was with him and restrained him through a woman named Abigail. The Lord was with David as he had to continue to run and hide for his life and defend himself and provide for himself and his men, waiting for 13 long years to get the position that would be rightfully his. The Lord was with David when King Saul died, and David was only allowed to be king over the king of Judah, or the tribe of Judah to begin with. The Lord was with David for 7.5 years while other things went on politically, until the time came where the other tribes followed suit with Judah, and David became king over all of Israel like God had promised. The Lord was with David, and David was with the Lord. David was on God's side. And remember this, my friends, when you're doing what God wants you to do and you're on God's side, you can't fail. Even though it may look like it at the moment that things aren't going very well, God's still working and bringing things together. Now, according to some studies, Israel, when David first took the throne, had 6,000 square miles of territory. But before David's leadership was over, that 6,000 square miles had exponentially increased to 60,000 square miles, 10 times the increase of territory. How does something like that happen? Well, David did his part. He was a man after God's own heart. He was true to the Lord and trusted in him, even when he needed a little help to do the right thing. But he kept plugging along. He kept waiting and trusting, even when it didn't feel good, even when he didn't feel like it, even when he was tempted to be impatient. He sought the Lord, and he found the strength and the help to continue to wait on the Lord. And his patience paid off, and God blessed him for it. My friends, I don't know what you might have been waiting on for the Lord to do in you or through you. But please let me encourage you tonight. Don't give up. Those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They'll mount up with wings like eagles. They'll run and not be weary. They'll walk and not faint. Waiting for the Lord's timing always pays off. Whatever you're waiting on, my prayers are with you, that the Lord will see you through and that you'll trust him to do so. Trust me, it's worth it. And by the way, I get it. I don't like being patient either. But the Lord is worth waiting on. God bless you tonight. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. We'll see you next week. Have a good evening.